All right, let's jump right into this explainer. I want you to picture the global economy as this massive, complex engine. Most of the time, the gears hum along nicely, but what happens when that engine suddenly seizes up? When output just grinds to an absolute halt and unemployment skyrockets?
This brings us to the ultimate question, one that divides experts literally every single time a major crisis hits. Do we just stand back, trust the internal mechanisms, and wait for the machine to fix itself? Or do we jump in and force a jumpstart?
To answer that, we're going to explore a blueprint drawn up back in the 1930s by British economist John Maynard Keynes. His theory, known as Keynesian Economics, basically argues that during times of deep instability, the government absolutely has to put on the overalls and act as the mechanic. Now, what's really fascinating is how Keynes completely went against the classical economic thinking of his day. The old school thought was that a broken economy would just naturally self-correct, that eventually lower wages would tempt employers to start hiring again. But Keynes, he looked around at the grim reality of the Great Depression and argued that fear and gloom are actually self-fulfilling. He pointed out that if you just lower wages, people have even less money to spend, and that actually hurts demand even further.
And right there, that word demand, that is the absolute core concept of this entire explainer. Keynes believed that aggregate demand is the primary driver of all economic growth and employment. When the Great Depression hit, business pessimism caused that aggregate demand to just completely fall off a cliff. People stopped buying, so businesses stopped producing, so workers got fired, which meant people bought even less. Keynes realized the only way to break this vicious cycle was to artificially create demand.
So how do you do that? To fight that cycle of gloom, Keynes pushed for what we call counter-cyclical fiscal policy. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it basically means the government deliberately uses deficit spending to boost consumer demand exactly when everyone else in the private sector is cutting back. Basically, when the rest of the world slams on the brakes, the government has to slam on the gas. But to really get why this works, we have to look analytically at human behavior. Think about your own wallet right now. If you suddenly got an unexpected $1,000, maybe a stimulus check, would you stash it in a savings account or would you go out and spend it? This concept is called the marginal propensity to consume. Keynesians desperately want you to spend it because your spending becomes a business's income. So, the entire theory really hinges on what happens to a single dollar. According to Keynesian fiscal policy, $1 of government stimulus actually creates significantly more than $1 in economic growth. It sounds like magic, for sure, but it's purely analytical. Well, it's actually the multiplier effect in action. Here's how it works. The government injects a single dollar into the economy. A business earns that dollar and uses it to pay its workers. Those workers then take their extra income and spend it at, say, the grocery store. The grocery store pays its suppliers, and on it goes. That one injected dollar cascades through the entire system, meaning the total gross domestic product grows by way more than that initial amount. Because of this multiplier effect, Keynes was actually super critical of excessive saving during a crisis. To him, hoarding cash is like draining fuel from the economic engine right when it desperately needs combustion. He believed that more money sitting stagnant literally meant less money in the economy stimulating growth. Unless you were saving for a specific purpose, just sitting on cash doesn't create jobs and it stalls the recovery. Now, government spending is just one side of the coin. Beyond fiscal policy, Keynesians also advocate pulling the monetary lever. This means adjusting the money supply and aggressively lowering interest rates to force money out of dormant savings accounts and get it circulating back into the active market. When interest rates are lowered, you're essentially lubricating the gears of the economy because money becomes incredibly cheap to borrow. This incentivizes businesses and individuals to take out loans, allowing them to consume and invest more. Ultimately, this reinvigorates employment through short-term demand growth. It's a calculated chain reaction meant to jolt the system back to life. But, analyzing this critically, we have to ask, what are the limits of this machine? What happens when that monetary lever just snaps? Lowering interest rates is great, but what happens when those rates hit zero and mathematically can't go any lower without going into negative territory? Economists call this the zero-bound problem. When you hit zero, you run a huge risk of falling into a liquidity trap. Even though borrowing is practically free, sheer panic still overrides the market. People and businesses are so spooked they prefer to just hoard cash or buy super safe short-term treasuries rather than actually invest. When this happens, lowering rates stalls out completely. And Keynesians argue that at this point, direct government spending, the fiscal policy we just talked about, is the absolute only tool left in the toolbox.
However, to be totally impartial and analytical, this explainer wouldn't be complete without examining the flip side. Highly influential economists, folks like Milton Friedman and Murray Rothbard, strongly pushed back on all of this. They argued that the Keynesian model fundamentally misrepresents the relationship between savings, investment, and growth.
These critics outline some seriously heavy long-term side effects to the Keynesian approach. They argue that continually printing and ejecting money can spark severe inflation. Deficit spending leads to bloated national budgets and massive public debt that future generations are going to have to pay off. Furthermore, many argue this artificial market interference stops the economy from finding its true natural equilibrium, and that the famous multiplier effect is actually far less potent in the real world than it is on a chalkboard.
Yet, even with these fierce debates about debt and inflation, the Keynesian playbook has remained the dominant reality for global governments. Whether we're looking back at the Great Depression of the 1930s, the Great Recession in 2008, or the massive global shock of the 2020 pandemic, policymakers have consistently turned to Keynes. In fact, you'll probably recognize these modern applications instantly. Think about the 2008 bank bailouts, or the COVID-19 stimulus checks sent straight to citizens, expanded unemployment benefits, and huge public infrastructure spending. These are all textbook Keynesian responses. The core concept of artificially boosting aggregate demand to stabilize a panicked market is still driving modern policy whenever the engine sputters.
Which brings us to a final critical thought to wrap up this explainer. As we face rising public debt and waves of modern inflation, we really have to evaluate the true legacy of John Maynard Keynes. When we artificially stimulate the market during a crisis, are we actually fixing the economic engine, or are we just borrowing parts from the future to keep it running today? It's a massive question, and hopefully one you are now perfectly equipped to think through.